bringing together powerful voices, climate activists, sustainability leaders, and key policymakers. The Times Network India Climate Summit united to shape an actionable agenda for a climate-resilient India. With a clear directive for impactful climate action for the next decade, the summit championed dialogue and discussion on fostering a resilient India through energy, action, and sustainability at the center. Across every session, distinguished experts and change makers shared insights, solutions, and strategies, championing awareness and protecting the future of our planet. Together, the agenda for a sustainable tomorrow was set down for the next decade. In this episode, joining us was a distinguished panel featuring Ashish Khanna, Director General, International Solar Alliance, Aarti Khosla, founder of Climate Trends, and Amit Verma, Director of Environment and Climate Change at NITI Aayog, examine the international COP pledges and the landscape of climate diplomacy led by India.
A lot of you here sitting might have wondered, there is so much spoken about climate change. There's a lot of discussion that's happened today. There are a lot of international conferences, world leaders that talk about climate change, but why is nothing changing? Sometimes we wonder if the issue is we talk a lot about climate change and not much about climate action. And that's exactly is what we'll be discussing with our guests here, Aarti ji. When it comes to climate finance, hardly anything was delivered. Where does India stand at this moment? Because at the end of the day, it's the developed nations that actually do all the talking. But when it comes to financing, they take a step back. What role does India play to ensure that these so-called developed nations actually come forward and pay up for climate action as well?
We are cutting to chase in the last session. We are hitting the nail right on the head when we talk about finance. And everybody knows that's the elephant in the room, so to speak. Every year, so many COP discussions only break down at the point of developed nations either shifting goalpost or not being in a position to commit conclusively to what is finance, how can climate finance move, what is it that they can do in being able to fulfill their historical responsibility. And I think we have literally come to a point now in the world that we are looking at multiple battles and wars being fought across the world, while we are still continuing with the battle on finance as it was 10, 15 years ago. When the Copenhagen COP happened in 2009, there was a random and arbitrary figure that was agreed of $100 billion per year. None of that was delivered till 2023, when magically it was said that 100 billion has now been delivered. And when the COP happened in Dubai, and after that in Baku, the whole discussion mainly was that if $100 billion per year was a figure that we lived with for the 15 years, how is it that a new collective quantified goal will be achieved? In the COP jargon, it used to be called the NCQG. It still is referred to as the NCQG, which means what's the new number? How will you quantify it? And how is it collective, which means which countries will contribute? And again, as you can imagine, with the realities of the world are shifting so much that in the last 15 to 17 years, it's literally come to a point where none of the developed countries want to put in $1 without China being in the room, just because of the situation of China as a superpower in all aspects. And therefore, it's almost like you keep adding problems, but you don't come to a solution. I would say as regards India's stand, it's at least two strands. Internationally, we are the voice of the global south. We also speak unified with members of G77 and like-minded countries, and therefore we keep our stance that India speaks about historical responsibility to be completed and developed world to make a contribution and make sure that to the developing world they provide new finance, concessional finance, and finance which can actually help development in least developing countries. None of that is happening. There is another side which is slightly more exciting, which speaks to India's renewable targets, which speaks to India's electrification of transport, and also speaks to a lot of private finance coming, where really the excitement is. And I think when we talk about finance, it's important to keep two things always in mind, that we have to be the flag bearers of showing the world where their responsibility is and where they are not delivering. But at the same time, we cannot afford to waste any time, which is not what we are doing, and which is why we are also making sure that we are thinking about what are the innovative ways to bring finance into our industry, into our new and renewable energy, into our electric vehicle space, so that we are also keeping going, whilst at the same time keeping our voice in the world loud and clear, that Global South and a lot of the developing countries have never received the climate finance that was promised. And actually, it's not just a question of climate finance, it's a question of justice, it's a question of equity and fairness, and that's where it becomes really complicated and three-dimensional.
India has not just been a very vocal supporter of actions to be taken in terms of climate change, India has also taken a lot of actions. How does India now ensure that all of the talks that happen, what more can India do to ensure that its leadership can prove to be the persuasive point that takes the entire conversation forward, and the countries that crib a lot, I'm sorry to use this word, the countries that crib a lot about climate change and blame it on the developing nations actually even help in financing the solution?
I totally understand the point of view that there is expectation in the form of common but differentiated responsibilities and polluter principle, and so many concepts are there as far as these international negotiations are concerned, and putting the onus on developed country to pay for it. But it's something which we have been talking about for a long time, and climate change is here and now, and it's happening, and we cannot wait infinitely for that finance to come. So there are actions which are happening, of which solar is one part of, very important part of it. There are NDCs, there are pledges which India has made, and there are strides which we can make with the budget we already have. There is expenditure which is happening, especially on the adaptation side, I would say. So mitigation, and globally, I would say there is a strong shift from now mitigation towards realizing that adaptation is something which is happening to our people, our own infrastructure, our own economy, and we need to invest in that, which can wait no more. So using that money efficiently is also a very important point which we need to focus on while we are waiting for all those negotiations to pan out.
A very interesting point that you made there, that with every passing year, there's a growing understanding and a realization across the world that climate change is real. Let me also welcome Mr. Ashish Khanna from the International Solar Alliance as well. He's here. A big round of applause for him as well. And this, I believe, is the right time for us to drift our conversation from what has happened, what hasn't happened, to clean energy. I'll just let Mr. Ashish Khanna take a breath there. Aarti ji, we've been talking about clean energy, and that is a point that you wanted to make earlier as well. India is rapidly scaling up its clean energy dependency. But at the end of the day, when we talk about energy in India, it is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. What exactly is India doing, and how much more can India do to ensure that there is a sort of a self-reliance when it comes to clean energy, and we don't just talk, we also walk?
I think we are walking. We're past that stage where we were just walking fast. I think we are at a point where we are in a stable situation. And
are we sprinting?
It will take a while to sprint. You need strength and resource, and that comes from money as well. And my other panelists can speak to it more eloquently. But the whole journey as it started in 2010, then solar targets of 2014, and then the NDCs that we submitted in 2015, and afterwards, how much are we? Maybe we are already like to 20 gigawatts or thereabouts when it comes to renewable energy sources, and we've made a commitment of about 500 gigawatts by 2030. So we're nearly there. We're in the right direction of travel. I think that is less of a worry on whether, in my view, whether we will actually do 500 or we will do 470. We would have established at least a situation where we are continuing to move from that point forward. And I think there are several things that come into that picture. Even today, as I understand, a lot of the renewable projects are funded by private banks and financial institutions. India's exposure to, like in Indian banks, the exposure to power sector is about 5 to 7%. But even then, if a lot of public banks are continuing to fund thermal power plants as opposed to new and renewable, then those are the shifts I suppose we will definitely have to make. In some cases, probably it is not about just getting international finance. It's about trying to see what are the innovative ways in which you can turn around the savings that are there domestically to be able to fund the renewable expansion that you have to do domestically. But on the other hand, security is a very big issue at the moment. It applies to defense and military security. It applies to climate security, and it also applies to energy security. And when you have waterways being closed and oil prices on the precipice of increasing all of that, I think it's also a situation where any country at the moment is going at a all-the-above type of a scenario, which is also what India is doing. I think it's not really a question of what are we doing right now. It's more a question of how do we look at the next 10, 15, 20 years of our trajectory. We are also the fourth largest economy in the world. We've literally overtaken Japan to come at that position. We're no longer able to afford even giving internationally that image that we are sticking to fossil fuel expansion in the way that the world was doing 15, 20 years ago. You don't build a new regime which is based on traditional power, and I think that's the communication change that the Indian side will have to make, because when you go at the international meetings, when you go at the United Nations Framework Convention, it's almost like the rest of the world is shifting to new sources, but India and China are not. That's probably not the reality. The reality lies somewhere in the middle, and I think it's really important, especially Ashish ji is here and we'll talk about the Solar Alliance, but the solar diplomacy that India has done in the last couple of years, the fact that we have the most ambitious renewable targets, the fact that we are also able to fulfill through domestic resource mobilization a lot of those targets, how we are receiving far more money into new renewables than we are receiving into coal, how the price discovery of renewables is literally 3 rupees per unit, while that for a new thermal plant is 6 to 7. So if you look at the cost benefit, people are going to go into new and renewable sources as opposed to power plants. But there are certain criteria which is more long-term, setting up energy mix. There is still a natural gas target of 15%. We are just about 6 to 7%. Some things you don't change immediately, but as long as, in my view, the direction of travel is where you must go, then we are on the right path.
Aarti ji here was talking about the issues when it comes to clean energy. And from what I understood, financing and scale is a major barrier when it comes to clean energy. How is India, and particularly the International Solar Alliance as well, what exactly is the ISA doing to ensure that financing doesn't become a big barrier when it comes to adaptation of clean energy?
The world did about $2.2 trillion of clean technology investments. Unfortunately, only 15% of that came to developing countries. And only 2% is coming to Africa, which has 600 million Africans without energy access and a very good solar radiation data. So definitely our role is to see how can trillions that are there in pension funds and others start investing in clean technology. The reason that doesn't happen are largely twofold. One, private sector and pension funds are looking for clarity of policies and regulations that can support their long-term investments. So ISA works on policy and regulatory reforms, and actually there India is a great test case of how clarity of policy, strong political push, and then ecosystem creation with financial institutions, private sector development, and others can pave the way for what India has done, 110 gigawatt of solar. We are taking this example to other places. I would say in India's case, the financing challenge on your last question is much more on transmission, because transmission will be one of the binding constraints, and of course land availability. So those in terms of how do we finance, how do we reduce the risk, and for that, there are a lot of financial innovation of risk mitigation instruments, use of infrastructure investment trusts that are going to be very vital for India.
Mr. Amit, we are looking at what's happening around the world. There are wars everywhere, there are conflicts. India has also been involved in a few of them. The reality is the priorities of nations keep changing. And unfortunately, clean energy and environmental change comes at the bottom when you look at it. India, again, like you said, like Aarti ji also said, is now beginning to focus and scale up a lot when it comes to clean energy. But then what about the lack of resources? What happens when the supply chain, when it comes to minerals, for example, like lithium? It's a major factor for India's drive towards clean energy. What happens when these sort of supply chains are affected? How does India plan to counter it? Because India doesn't want to be dependent on any other nation, I'm sure, for its clean energy reliance.
I mean, there are wars which are fought explicitly, and there are wars which are fought implicitly through trade wars, through mineral wars, through denial of technology, denial of resources. So war is like a continuous process which is happening, and countries need to evolve, need to secure themselves against those kind of restrictions. So if you look at India's own journey, there is, at the international level, we are seeing what is happening. You've aptly mentioned on what's going on. We are all aware of, without naming the neighbor, that there have been many restrictions on that sense from the economic power that it is in terms of denial of access to minerals. So there is action on international front. For example, India has formed a PSU named Kabil, which is now going and exploring outside India on what mineral resources we can secure on. So it's important to look out across the world, secure through FTAs, through treaties on what important resources are required inside the country. So Government of India also came out with the critical mineral mission, in which the idea is that anything what we have in terms of natural resources has to be explored, but also what we have in terms of import is also not wasted, which also links with us with the circular economy initiatives. So anything which is imported must not be wasted as such. So there is a strong focus on circularity of many of the waste streams like lithium-ion batteries, e-waste, vehicles, where we want to ensure that any of the important minerals which are not available in India as such are not wasted as such. So it's a multi-pronged thing. Then we also need to focus on the R&D itself. Today, lithium seems to be the obvious choice, but can we develop batteries which work as well with sodium, which is the next higher element in the periodic table? If that happens, would we still have that kind of dependency? That is a question we need to answer.
He was talking a lot about clean energy and how India is trying to secure its future. Help us understand how organizations like ESA, for example, are helping nations like India to secure their clean energy future.
I'll answer that question in two parts. The first part is that energy security of how much India wants to do is now closely linked to industrial policy of how much India is producing. And that requires, in our assessment, perhaps a deeper thinking that should India be preparing a supply chain that is not completely everything only in India, but some other neighboring or like-minded countries that can still reduce the overall cost of, say, solar PV. We are seeing a push in all countries, including India, that let's integrate the entire manufacturing within our country. I feel an alternate supply chain requires some countries to come together rather than individual countries. The second important question on that is, what is the right balance within existing technologies and new technologies? And for India's energy security, it is very important to have the right policy, not only trying to see what we make today, but what we are going to make 10, 20 years from now, because there's a lot of innovation happening on new technologies, building integrated PV, perovskite, solid-state batteries. I think a huge R&D push, but also a lot of startups who can see how these technologies can be commercialized are very important.
Absolutely. And before we wrap in a while, I started off on the note that everyone's looking forward to COP30, but the reality is, if you look at what's happened since then, a lot of promises have remained on paper. A lot of ideas that were floated haven't got financing, which means that with COP30, there is a lot of doubt, a lot of questions being asked. What can India do to push these so-called developing nations that speak a lot about climate change? What can India do? I come back to the same point. Diplomacy is what we're talking about. What can India do to push these developed countries to not just talk about climate change, but also finance it?
I think a lot of the alliances at the moment are shifting. The traditional alliances as they existed with Annex 1 countries, as they were called, which is a lot of the Western countries of the world, you're at a point where the US is no longer in the Paris Agreement the second time. And who is going to take that position? The Bonn intercessionals concluded only yesterday, and my read of that is that the way negotiations happened, it almost feels like whether US is in the room or not, nobody is able to assume that vacuum that exists. So that's one side of the story. Is there thinking on the Brazilian side, and what is it that India can do? Our Prime Minister is going to Rio to attend BRICS. He's also going to Argentina thereafter. And I think it will be interesting to see on what happens at the BRICS forum with regard to either the BRICS commitment to nationally determined contributions, or how even the BRICS countries are going to come together and keep both the G20 as well as the COP intact, because the G20 is in South Africa, the COP with Brazil, and Brazil really has some work to do when it comes to the politics of the COP. At the moment, it's quite unclear on where they are going to land. They have produced some letters to the presidency, and when you read those letters, they have a lot of right words in them. They are talking about action agenda. They are talking about globally determined contribution as opposed to nationally determined contribution. The problem is the world is not at a situation where multilateralism is at its best. So if you don't have multilateral unison, how are you talking of a globally determined contribution? It's quite difficult. There are several aspects that Brazil has put. It talks about preserving forests. It talks about phasing out fossil fuels. It talks about funding. So they are pitching it as three Fs: fossil fuel, forests, and funding. And I think even if they were to work with India on one aspect, whether it's talking about clean energy and tripling renewables and looking at fossil fuels, or even trying to bring something on the table on finance, which actually, frankly, looks quite hard, because the whole road from Baku to Belem looks like it's less of a road and more bumps over there just because of the global situation. It's not possible for any country to sign a blank check at the moment. You have to look at sources of funding that are innovative, or you have to make a business case for it so that investments can flow where there is return of investment. There is no blank check. So I think India has a lot of work cut out. And this is diplomacy. You can see that the Brazilian president was in China. EU and China are speaking to each other. There is precedence on how some countries play quite smartly when it comes to these international negotiations. And I feel that for India to also get ahead of that curve, speak for itself, but also speak for a lot of the global south, preserve its position, but also actually give some ideas on what is it that is possible in terms of a common minimum. There is job to be done.
With that, thanks a lot for joining us here for this conversation. It's been a very insightful conversation.